we're going to take a detailed look at why the seemingly dry issue of postal voting has become a major political issue in America. The presidential election's in November, and COVID-19 means voting is going to take a lot longer at polling booths. So a lot of states are looking at expanding postal voting, and the president doesn't like it.
I think that mail-in voting is a terrible thing. I think if you vote, you should go. Mail-in ballots are very dangerous. There's tremendous fraud involved and tremendous illegality. They want to send out thousands and thousands of ballots, and then they're going to send them back. Who knows who signed the ballot? Is anybody standing there acknowledging, oh, that was Mr. Smith? This will be, in my opinion, the most corrupt election in the history of our country, and we cannot let this happen.
Now, of course, just because Donald Trump keeps saying something repeatedly doesn't make it true. There's no evidence of widespread fraud in postal voting, and we'll get into more detail on that in a moment. But first of all, here's some background on postal voting in the US. 4 years ago, about a quarter of ballots were posted, and the rate very much varies state to state. In some, you have to go to the polling station unless you have a valid excuse. Being over 65 is considered one, living away from home is two. Then around half the states allow any registered voter to vote by post. And then you have 11 other states where you have to vote by post, and that number's actually doubled because of the pandemic. So postal voting is on the rise, and we're expecting states to further ease restrictions on it as we head towards the election in November. Now, like a lot of things in the US, this follows the political divide. In this case, Democrats are keen, Republicans definitely are not. And understanding the reasons why can tell us plenty about the election. Well, as we heard, President Trump thinks postal voting results in fraud. The Republican Party is pushing that message too. For example, in adverts like this one.
Are you tired of driving all the way to a polling location to vote? Sick of always having to remember your ID to get a ballot? Worry no more, because the fix is in. Introducing Ballot Harvest. Get fresh ballots delivered right to your door. Make your voice heard as many times as you want. We've rigged up our system to churn out ballots for every living thing in the country. Millions a day.
Well, people who study elections say it's simply not the case that fraud is common in postal voting. There are some individual stories. In New Jersey, its municipal elections in May were postal only because of the pandemic. Since then, 2 Democratic councilmen have been charged with fraud for allegedly approaching voters and collecting their ballots. And that was connected to the discovery of hundreds of ballots in one mailbox in the city of Paterson. Further south, 2 years ago, a congressional election had to be rerun after the Republican campaign seemingly broke the law. A campaign consultant faces criminal charges relating to allegations that he hired people to collect postal ballots and fill them in. Well, Mark Harris was the Republican candidate in this case. He had been in the lead by 900 votes, but the result was annulled. At the election board hearing, he agreed with that.
I believe a new election should be called. It's become clear to me that the public's confidence in the 9th District seat general election has been undermined to an extent that a new election is warranted.
Well, here's more on the issue in the US from Lorna Atkinson at the University of New Mexico.
It's very hard to find fraud. I think there's very little fraud, but where we do find it, it is systematic, and it's meant to overturn elections. What I'm most concerned about in this election is the perception of fraud, and how that might lead to feelings of delegitimacy of people's votes, or a feeling that the election outcome itself is in jeopardy, that maybe it's not honest. If people don't feel that the election is free and fair, then the whole enterprise of democracy becomes a lot more difficult.
Now, one of President Trump's tweets prompted Twitter to do something it hadn't done to him before. It fact-checked it and put a warning sign saying the claims were unsubstantiated. So if the president's claim about widespread fraud is false, why does he keep making it? Well, this may explain it. President Trump thinks postal voting proposals will help the Democrats. On Fox News in March, he said they had levels of voting that if you'd ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again. And there's this interview President Trump gave to Politico in which he said mail-in voting could cost him re-election and that the biggest risk was losing the legal challenges his campaign has against postal voting. Now, to be clear, what the president's saying about increased turnout hurting Republicans is received wisdom in American politics. But the reality looks like it's actually more complex. Here's Lonna Atkinson again.
There's no evidence. So we see that, Utah, for example, and Arizona are states that are vote by mail states, and they're Republican states. And then you have, the coast, California, Oregon, and Washington, which are blue states. And they're also either vote by mail or high vote by mail states. And so we don't see that it per se helps one party or the other. And so, it helps whatever party is biggest in your state.
There's certainly concern among Republicans that if this election is close, postal votes may tip the balance against them. Mirka Mosbacher is on the Trump National Advisory Board.
While there has not been widespread fraud, it's usually about 1%. According to this institution technology study, for example, the part of the issue is that in a close election, such as in 2000, remember the Florida recount? When it's a close election and you have this potential for individuals to take advantage of the system, it can make a big difference.
Well, Republicans have already tried to strike down postal voting in some states before the election. If things go against President Trump in November, another option is to try and do so after the vote. His critics allege that by casting doubt on the process now, the president may be laying the ground to challenge the results later in the courts. His challenger, Joe Biden, says it's my greatest concern that this president is going to try and steal this election. Let's be clear, President Trump says if he loses, he'll leave office quietly, but some are still worrying he won't. Peter Nicholas is a reporter with The Atlantic. He asks here, would the president honour the peaceful transfer of power if it meant admitting failure? Anthony Scaramucci was White House communications director, albeit just for a few days. He's since become a fierce opponent of the president.
So I'm actually the contrarian on that. I think if he loses, he leaves. There's other people that think he doesn't lose. He'll stay. Newsweek just put out an article by two very smart guys talking about how he could use some of the aggressive executive powers to keep himself in the presidency. I don't think the American military would stand for that. I think he has the worst relationship as commander-in-chief in modern history with the American military. So I think they will eject him like an Austin Powers villain from the White House if he loses, whether it's narrowly. He's not going to lose narrowly. He's going to get wiped out.
Well, what everyone can agree on is that the outcome should be peaceful. We saw some ugly scenes back in 2016 after the last election. There were riots in Portland and in other places after Hillary Clinton lost. This time around, there are concerns again about how some of President Trump's supporters may react if he were to lose. This heavily armed biker gang was filmed patrolling outside the recent Trump rally in Tulsa. They call themselves the Cowboy Militia, and they said they were there to protect free speech. Elsewhere in the country, other militia groups have threatened violence if, as they see it, President Trump is cheated out of office. Well, any number of issues to work through. Anthony Zerka is live with us from Washington. Anthony, first of all, given this is a federal election, why is there not a standardized approach to postal voting across the US?
The bottom line is that's the way the Constitution set it up. There's an elections clause in the Constitution that says states have the grounds to regulate the time, place, and manner of elections. Now, Congress and the federal government can step in and supersede state laws, but when the states get the first crack at it, essentially. So there have been times with civil rights laws and the Department of Motor Vehicle Registration that Congress has given guidelines states have to respect, but when push comes to shove, it's the states that get the first crack.
Now, clearly, Anthony, it's in the interests of Donald Trump's opponents to present him as someone who might not accept the transfer of power. But when you look at what has actually happened, either from Donald Trump or his supporters, is there really any evidence this is something that people should be concerned about?
There's not a whole lot of evidence. I mean, I heard the same sort of thing 4 years ago in October of 2016 among, some Donald Trump supporters who said that they weren't going to accept the results of the election if he lost to Hillary Clinton. But, that was just I think the emotions running high at the time. And the Constitution sets a timeline for when a president's term ends. It's in January of the year following the election, and it would be very difficult outside of these fairly creative hypotheses that some people are advancing that Donald Trump would be able to stay in if he loses the election.
All right, Anthony, we'll leave it there. So we may be in a situation where making these kind of questions and allegations may suit Donald Trump's opponents. It may also suit him to suggest that in some way he's up against the system. Of course, the election is in early November.